Hi, third grade. It's time for Soldier Dogs. And yesterday, when we left off, Matt and Rachel were in the crypt down below the cathedral. It sounds like it's kind of a spooky place, but there's a lot of people down there with them. And he was looking for his mom. And he's really worried about where his mom is. And then he saw someone coming, but it just turned into a bearded man in pajamas who stepped into the shelter and shouted, "The bombers are getting closer." Chapter 6. A fearful hush fell across the shelter. Matt's breath caught and his fists clenched. What if a high explosive bomb scored a direct hit on the cathedral? Would a bunch of extra dirt be enough to protect them? But an instant later, the hush ended. Conversation returned. Calm returned. And an easy confidence spread throughout the room. One thing that Matt had noticed about the British, they weren't very good at panicking. He still felt a bit panicky, though, trapped in a crypt during an air raid without his parents. Chief nudged Matt again. "What, boy?" Matt's worried gaze flicked downward. "You still can't have a sandwich." Chief gave a short yip and looked intently at the door. And to Matt's relief, his mother entered, helping Mrs. Lloyd into the shelter. Matt almost laughed in relief and almost laughed again when she saw Mrs. Lloyd. She was wearing Matt's father's woolen hunting cap with ear flaps. His mom must have wanted to keep her head warm in the chilly June night. "There she is," he blurted a little too happily. Not that I was worried." Rachel exhaled. "It is good she is here." "Stay with Chief," he told Rachel, and he trotted across the crypt. He slipped between the columns to the small crowd around his mother. He squirmed through and found Mrs. Lloyd lying on one of the few bunks. Despite the cool crypt air, her face was glossy with sweat beneath his father's woolen hat. A bunch of ladies stood around the bunk. One of them was stringing up a clothesline to hang a curtain for privacy. Another chatted with a priest from the cathedral. Matt felt a spark of pride that his mother was the one holding Mrs. Lloyd's hand. "Mom," he said, squeezing forward. "There you are, sweetie," his mother shot him a distracted smile. "Find a place to settle in where you aren't in the way." "Aren't you coming?" he asked. "We're supposed to stay together. That's the plan." "I need to stay with Mrs. Lloyd right now." Despite her pale face, Mrs. Lloyd smiled as she offered Matt the woolen hat. "I'm afraid I need to borrow your mother a little longer than I borrowed your father's hat." Matt took the hat and looked past Mrs. Lloyd to his mother. "You told me a million times if there's an air raid, stay together. Now Dad's not even here, and you're—" "Matt, please," she said. There was a warning note in her voice. "Not now." "Fine," he grumbled. It wasn't fair, but that didn't surprise him. Nothing was fair when you're a kid. "Thank you. Now you look after Rachel." His mother's gaze moved past Matt's shoulder. "And Rachel, you look after Matt." When Matt returned, he found Rachel at his elbow, chewing on the tip of her braid, with Chief standing beside her. Great. First his mother scolded him when she was the one ignoring the air raid plan. Then she didn't even say anything about Rachel wandering around. One of the women gave Matt an armload of blankets and shooed him away. He stalked toward the column in the corner. "I told you to stay there," he told Rachel. She didn't answer. She just tagged along like always. "At least we have blankets," he said. You can go back to sleep. But I'm not sleepy. Yeah, he said. Well, if I go to sleep, I'm sure you'll follow. She tugged at her braid and fell silent again. She looked small and young and miserable. Matt felt bad for snapping at her, so he tried to change the subject. Hey, you know what they call these raids? Raids have a name? Well, last year the Germans bombed London, right? That was called the Blitz, Rachel said, though she pronounced it Blitz. That was called the Blitz. That's right, Matt said. They dropped bombs on London every single day for 3 months. They destroyed a third of our city. Matt stopped at the column where they had been earlier. Well, now the British are starting to hit back. Like Eric, she said, fighting the Japanese? Yeah, like Eric. So the Germans switched to these air raids as a response, kind of like a payback. They call this the Baedeker Blitz. Rachel wrinkled her nose. What is a Baedeker? Baedeker. They're guidebooks, I guess, like travel guides. The Germans want to stop the travel? She asked. No, they want to break the British spirits, make all the people feel hopeless. So they're targeting important buildings, historical sites, things like that. The Nazis said they're going to bomb every city with a 3-star rating in the Baedeker guides. And Canterbury is a city that has 3 stars? Huh. We're a 5-star city, Matt told her, even though he wasn't sure if it was true. Still, he figured if they were getting bombed, they deserved as many stars as possible. He spread the blankets beside the wall behind a column in a quiet nook. He sat beside Rachel and patted the floor. Down, Chief. Instead of lying beside Matt, Chief nuzzled Rachel, then lay down beside her. Like he didn't even remember whose dog he was. Matt scowled to himself and lifted the woolen hunting cap to his nose. It smelled like his father and his real home back in the United States. It smelled like wood smoke and snowfall and pipe tobacco. With his father always working and Eric on a boat in the Pacific, Matt was trying to be the man of the family. But he didn't feel very grown up. He just felt tired and cranky and scared. All he wanted to do was curl up and cry. And the bombs hadn't even started falling around the shelter. At least not yet. Is there time for one more chapter? Okay, chapter 7. The girl pup's breathing turned quieter. Remember, they're talking as if the people are pups. It's kind of like what Chief thinks that Rachel is a pup and Matt is a pup. The girl pup's breathing turned quieter. She wasn't asleep, but she was resting. Her skinny arm draped across Chief's shoulder. Meanwhile, the boy pup, Matt, watched his mother on the other side of the stone cave. Chief saw Matt's sadness as clear as if the boy pup had a tail between his legs. He was scared, and he wanted to be with his parents. But his father wasn't there, and his mother was helping a woman who was going to give birth to a baby pup. Chief knew that a newborn would come soon. Not yet, though. He flared his nostrils and smelled sweat and soap in the stone cave. He smelled the scents of 100 different houses clinging to the clothing of all the humans. He smelled ash, too. He heard the growl of the iron birds in the sky, dropping more fire rocks on the city. Voices echoed and crashed in the stone cave, but through the clamor, Chief heard a familiar patter of footsteps. He cocked his head to locate the sound. There, at the entrance, the father was entering the stone cave. Chief woofed softly at Matt and twisted his ears to show where he was listening. "Dad!" Matt yipped and scrambled to his feet. Matt ran across the stone cave toward the father. Chief felt the boy pup's gladness, then noticed how the father was standing. His shoulders were slumped and his head was down. He looked like he was suffering, even though Chief didn't smell any blood. Chief's ears flattened against his head. Something was wrong with Matt's father. The girl pup, Rachel, noticed, too. She whined and followed the boy toward the old ones. Her head tail bobbed between her shoulders. Chief slunk along behind her and Matt. Before they reached the old ones, the father hugged the mother and started crying. "They sent the telegram to me at work," the father said. "It's Eric." Chief's ears pricked at the sound, Eric, and at the grief of the father's voice. Something was very wrong. "Oh no," the mother whimpered. "No, no." The humans whimpered softly to each other. The mother, she smelled of misery and hopelessness. "What?" Matt asked, stopping short. What's wrong?" His father made a noise like a wounded animal, and his mother knelt and took both her pups in her arms, both Rachel and Matt. She stroked their heads and talked quietly to them. Matt started shivering. Chief whined and licked his hand. Rachel was confused. She didn't understand what was wrong. She cried, though, feeling the mother and father's fear and sorrow. Chief heard the sound Eric again, and he made himself stay near the pups, even though he wanted to pace, and he wanted to prowl, and he wanted to hunt. Something was wrong with his pack. He needed to find the threat and stop it. But this wasn't the kind of threat you could sink your teeth into. This was worse. This was grief and loss. So Chief wedged himself between Rachel and Matt so they could lean on him if they needed to. Matt didn't lean. Instead, he wiped tears from his face and straightened up. His long arms tightened and his hands became fists, and his fear turned to a blaze of anger. "It's your fault," he shouted at his parents. "You could have stopped him. You didn't have to let him go. It's your fault Eric's gone. It's your fault." The boy howled and snarled, then ran away. Chief's muscles bunched with urgency. He wanted to stay with the grieving pack, with Rachel and the mother and the father, but he needed to follow Matt. He needed to protect